Well, that's today's news. Now let's take a look at tomorrow's. I'm joined by the Independent's Deputy Editor Archie Bland and Middle East commentator and journalist Nabila Ramdani. Warm welcome to you both again. Archie, in honour of your promotion to Deputy Editor, we will start with the Independent this evening, and you've got a story that you can tell us a lot more about, and your headline there, lobbyist plans to hijack people's petitions.
Yeah, it's interesting this. I mean, there's been a lot of attention on Bell Pottinger and other lobbying firms since last year, when there was a big story about the way that they were, for instance, willing to countenance taking business from fairly unsavoury clients. This is a story about quite an involved thing, but basically that the European Union has a forthcoming petitions thing, a bit like, you know, how we have e-petitions here now. They're supposed to be for ordinary people to try to influence the workings of the EU, to try and change EU law. And it's specified in the regulations around this thing that you're not supposed to try and get involved in it. If you're an organisation, you're not supposed to start these initiatives. We've got an email from Bell Pottinger that demonstrates that, in fact, they're saying that they can help people to devise these initiatives and talking to clients about how to try and turn these kind of things to their advantage. There's another
to
lobbying.
Circumnavigate the rules.
Yeah, effectively, you know, we've got Fleishman Hillard, who are another lobbying firm, saying openly on their website that they're doing the same thing. So it's just a question about, you know, quite often these processes are supposed to be for ordinary people to get involved, and in fact, big business takes over.
Has there been any response from the EU about this?
Well, we've spoken to people at the European Commission, the guy who's been involved in trying to set up this initiative, saying that this wasn't the point at all, and they really want to try and stop them muscling in, but it's very hard.
It makes you wonder, Nabila, if it's happening actually with petitions in this country, which we've seen quite a lot of. There's been quite a few who've really got a lot of votes and got a lot of attention of these people's petitions.
Yes, absolutely, and that's why I think this story has the potential to become an extremely important story, because it effectively allows big businesses and corporations to put their interests before the interests of private individuals, and PR is almost, you know, an essential component of, you know, any in public life nowadays, and corporations also realize that, as well as governments, and this effectively allows a corporation to bypass national governments to serve big corporates' interests. So it has the potential to become a really important story. I
mean, the counter argument, to play devil's advocate, they would put is, and it's fair enough to say that, you know, businesses are as legitimately allowed as anyone else to represent their views to government, and it's important they be heard. But the point is that there's this phenomenon called astroturfing, which is, i.e., the fake grassroots, and it's very common strategy in PR to try and create the impression that it's something that ordinary people think, whereas in fact it's just in order to try and serve your own needs as a business or as a corporation.
Okay, let's take a look at your other front page story. It's our lead story today, and it's going to be, I'm sure, on all front pages tomorrow. And this is the situation in Syria, which seems to be deteriorating by the hour. We've seen the violence cross the borders today, Nabila, the deaths across the border with Turkey and Lebanon, a Lebanese cameraman, we believe. And the violence spreads when we were really supposed to be in the last few hours before a ceasefire.
Absolutely. This is an extremely worrying development that the violence has now spilled over neighbouring countries. In Turkey, where Assad forces have been shooting at people trying to escape, to flee the country, but also in neighbouring Lebanon, where media people, journalists, and the cameraman was killed, actually, were targeted. And this ties in with the previous stories about the Assad regime deliberately targeting journalists for the information not to come out of Syria. And of course, there have been similar allegations behind the death of British journalist Marie Colvin and the French photographer Rémi Hochlik. And it doesn't bode well at all with President Assad, who is supposed to abide by a ceasefire tomorrow and pull his tanks from cities and towns. Instead, we're seeing an escalation of military activity, with planes being used, tanks as well, mortar rounds fired at people. He's essentially, for him, you know, he's back in the game. He's, you know, back in the driving seat, if I may put it that way.
I guess, you know, one of the key questions, I mean, I don't think anyone is terribly surprised that he's not abiding by the terms of the ceasefire. I guess that's not shocking news. But the thing that I was quite taken aback by was this news about it going into Turkey and to Lebanon. One of the big questions that will, I guess, become clear in the next few days is whether this is just kind of sporadic local gunfire that's essentially a mistake, or whether there's some kind of specific policy move in order to try and disturb, people, the borders, and make it harder for people to come in and out. And that would be quite a major escalation, because you can't imagine the Turkish government is going to take to that very warmly.
Well, Turkey is absolutely furious and said as much. The United States has described it as outrageous. And there have been similar condemnations in the past few days about the violence in general from France, saying it is unacceptable. The Pope yesterday spoke in his Easter address, condemning the violence as well. But it doesn't seem to have, any effect on Assad's posture.
What about China and Russia, of course, who've supported Syria so far? China have said that they're calling on Syria to honour their commitment of a ceasefire and to withdraw troops. This is probably the strongest condemnation yet we've had from China, nothing so far from Russia. But do you think, given that, there are possibly moves now in that direction, that they're losing support from Russia and China?
I think, China's statement is a sign of impatience with the attitude of the Assad regime, but nothing more than that, really. Syria is still a major trade partner for the Chinese. I think the trade flux as a whole is something near $2 billion a year between the two countries. The major ally of Syria is, of course, Russia, and Russia has backed up Syria all along, even in Assad's unrealistic demand to ask for rebel forces to end their attacks and put that in writing, which is essentially asking the rebel forces to surrender effectively. And even in that demand, Russia has shown utter support.
It's hard to believe. It would take, I think, a major escalation to the point where it was simply impossible. I mean, it already would seem to most other countries to be impossible. I think you would need another escalation again for Russia and China to change their minds, or for circumstances to become so clearly already against Assad that it wasn't worth their while. But I can't imagine tomorrow they're going to say that they're going to suddenly change their approach. Because
and 65% of Assad's weapons come from Russia, of course.
Archie, you mentioned no surprise that this ceasefire isn't going to be honoured. The problem is, for the UN, for the international community, there's no plan B, is there?
No, I mean, it does feel, it feels incredibly hard to be optimistic about what's going to happen, at least in the short term, because, this was the best of a bad bunch of options. There was at least a sort of a sliver of optimism when it was first announced, and, unsurprisingly, it hasn't come to anything, and it's quite hard to see where you go from here.
Let's take a look at the Guardian's front page, because that is just in a variety of stories here. Their headline there: Welcome joins academic spring to open up science. This is a research funding threat to journals that limit sharing. And on the right hand there, Labour could bar MPs for mayoral polls to save cash. Let's take a look at this story, the front page story, in a bit more detail. I know you're just seeing this for the first time, so I'll read a bit of it out to you. It says, one of the world's largest funders of science is to throw its weight behind a growing campaign to break the stranglehold of academic journals and allow all research papers to be shared online. That could be interesting, isn't it? Nearly 9,000 researchers have already signed up to a boycott of journals that restrict free sharing as part of a campaign dubbed the Academic Spring by supporters due to its potential for revolutionising the spread of knowledge. It might surprise a lot of people that doesn't happen already.
I do think it's a really interesting thing that we have this. I mean, I know when I've been working on stories that might require some kind of, acquaintance with some of this stuff, it's incredibly frustrating how hard it can be to access this sort of stuff. And the trouble is...
How do you? You have
to
pay
you've got
for
to have a subscription, and it's often very expensive.
And it's often on university websites where you need a password when you need to log in effectively.
But I guess it's part of this general movement towards, in the same way that every newspaper at very great expense to their bottom lines is free online, it's become something that people expect, the ability to see this stuff without paying for it.
But I would argue that for academic papers to genuinely become more democratic and be, accessible, it will take an awful lot of work from academics to make their own writing more accessible and write in a less jargonistic style.
Well, that's true. I mean, what I wonder is whether, I assume they've done some kind of work to try and figure out if there is, in fact, presumably the main focus of this is other academics. They're not so worried about you or me being able to see it, but the idea is to try and encourage the exchange of ideas and create more opportunities for people to build on other people's work. So I guess there must be a lot of academics who can't access some stuff themselves.
Let's have a look at a bit more detail about this other story. Labour could bar MPs from mayoral polls to save cash. It says senior shadow cabinet members who were shocked by Labour's Bradford West by-election defeat are questioning whether Labour MPs should be debarred from standing in mayoral and possibly police commissioners' elections in a bid to prevent another wave of by-elections that will drain the party's financial resources and possibly threaten safe Labour seats.
Well, it's a big problem, isn't it? You know, by-elections, if you're a big party, by-elections are always all they can be is bad for you. You know, by-elections between the terms of government never go well for the people who've got the seat, and you can see why they'd be trying whatever they could to avoid these kind of own goals happening again.
Okay, well, we will be back in just a moment with more of tomorrow's front pages. The Eye is just in. The headline there, the crisis in British nursing. We'll take a look at that in just a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're looking through the newspaper's front pages as they come in with the Independent's Deputy Editor Archie Bland and Middle East commentator and journalist Nabila Ramdani. Welcome back to you both. Before the break, we took a quick look at the Eye's front page, and they've got a report, an in-depth report, they say, an investigation, they're calling it, into what they're saying is a crisis in British nursing. And Archie, you're just giving me a bit more detail about this.
Yeah, it's basically looking at whether there are problems with the standard of nursing in hospitals. There's never really been any very rigorous study into standards of nursing and how they're doing, but there's lots of anecdotal evidence which would suggest there's a bit of a problem. For example, the number of complaints against nurses in hospitals doubled over the last couple of years. That's the kind of thing that we're seeing. And this piece looks at a bunch of evidence that, you know, talks to lots of people with some really hair-raising stories. And I mean, I know from a friend with personal experience of it that quite often the clinical care can be very good and you can get a very good operation or whatever, but then nurses are so busy and have so little time that people sometimes really feel they're left alone to try and make up their own recovery. And if you don't have family or whoever to help you, that can be incredibly difficult and make it very traumatic.
So it's more about the human aspect of it, of the profession that your paper was interested in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's this question of, you know, one big part of being in hospital is getting better, but the other part is going through an experience that doesn't leave you sort of traumatized and very upset. And I think that's a really important thing that hospitals have to contend with.
You were just saying during the break when we were talking about this story that there seems to be a taboo about criticising nurses. I would think the opposite, that if I were a nurse, I would think that actually they seem to get a bashing quite a lot. We seem to have a lot of stories where people are saying, just this thing, this quote here, the nurse told me she was busy, she didn't seem to notice I was lying in a pool of blood. And everyone will know they have such a difficult job to do, and they would argue, well, look, they're overstretched, they have so many people they have to look after and so many responsibilities these days.
And there have been quite a few stories about a poor treatment received by the elderly in particular in hospitals. So I think, you know, it's one of those professions that's constantly under scrutiny, I would say.
Yeah, but I guess the thing is that it's because nursing is such an obviously noble and important thing to do, it's maybe harder to have an honest conversation about the ways that it's done well and the ways it's not done so well than it might be if you're talking about something that was more kind of obviously procedural, like, you know, like banking. I mean, something where you don't immediately assume the people who do it are the good guys. It's much easier to scrutinise in a critical way than something which, you know, you work from the assumption that people are doing it for the right reasons and so on. So it's harder to kind of be rigorous about the way you look at it, I think.
Another story they've got here on the top right-hand corner there. Teachers declare war on Gove's academies. We've had 2 teachers' conferences this weekend, haven't we? With a lot of angry words over not just academies, but pay, pensions. They're going to be balloting the NUT, the NASUWT, talking about possible strikes, possibly next term, maybe the autumn. Do you think we're really going to see teachers on the warpath now with the government?
Right.
Well, I think the teachers branded the coalition as an unelected dictatorship, and they called for a mass resistance movement in the autumn in particular to oppose not only the regional pay plan, but also to oppose the growth of academies. The academies, of course, Tony Blair's project, and they were aimed at improving standards in the poorest areas. But those who oppose them also say that they suggest that schools shouldn't be put on the market effectively, that there shouldn't be a marketization of education.
And they're angry that they're being imposed on them. They say that some schools are being forced to become academies.
And also the numbers. I think this is right, that we're approaching, will eventually approach 50% of schools being academies. And I think there's quite a strong argument.
It's good. They're going to be the vast majority of secondary schools are going to be academies.
Right, and there's, you know, I think there's an argument for it as something that you do in schools that have particular problems in order to arrest the failure and then give them latitude to try and get up to speed. But if you're saying that it's going to be many more, you're effectively removing any kind of, you know, nationwide uniformity and making sure that
because they don't have to adhere to the curriculum.
Right, and also they don't have to adhere to pay standards. So that makes it very much more like a free market in education, which is very much more a conservative idea and one that teachers' unions are never going to be very keen on.
Okay, Daily Telegraph is just in. Let's have a look here. George Osborne, I'm going after the wealthy tax dodgers. Also, picture of Christina Schmidt, whose husband, you'll remember, Sergeant Olaf Schmidt, was killed defusing a bomb in Afghanistan in 2009. She has found love again. I'm sure many people will be very happy for her. She was very outspoken about the failings surrounding her husband at the time. Also, on the left-hand side, water firm to sell supplies to drought-hit region. What appeals to you there, Archie?
Well, I suppose it's the tax dodgers thing. I mean, it's definitely one of those bank holiday stories when a politician can get a kind of a nice positive headline. But, you know, if it's right that they're going to sort of try and do this and be much more rigorous on it, then that would be great. You know, the proof will be in the pudding because it's a headline we've read many, many times before. The fact that you're reading it again proves that it hasn't worked so far. But
it's in line with, you know, politicians, suggesting that there will be more transparency as to their own tax situation as well. Yeah. So I think there's definitely an effort to try and be as transparent as possible on, tax dodgers.
The problem is that the Tories are seen again and again as supporters of the wealthy, and, you know, by cutting the top rate of tax just a couple of weeks ago, the Chancellor's come in for that criticism as well. So he kind of has to be seen to be making these right noises now, doesn't he?
Well, I mean,
it's not good enough to, to hit the front pages. You know, people would want, the policies to actually be implemented.
Yeah. And there is a bit of a contradiction. It's quite easy to, he talks here about the, I think the 3 highest paid people in the country and how much they save every year. 20 biggest tax avoiders, but having a couple of weeks ago reduced the top rate tax from 50 to 45, you could argue there's an inconsistency. They say that, on the one hand, they say that we've got to reduce tax rates so that our richest people don't flee the country. On the other, they say we're going to make them pay much more. So there is definitely a sort of...
Well, they were saying that they reduced it because it didn't bring in as much as they thought it would.
Yeah.
But, so that's kind of a different matter, isn't it, to people manipulating the system, employing creative accountants to make sure that they, can put this money here, that money there. As mere mortals don't have to worry about that kind of thing, do we? Okay, let's take a look at the other front page story here, and this is water firms to sell supplies to drought-hit regions. The drought so severe in parts of Britain, plans are being drawn up to trade water between 2 regions for the first time to supply more than 100,000 homes in the worst-hit areas. It says Severn Trent aims to sell 30 million litres of water a day to Anglian Water, just one of the 7 companies that imposed a hosepipe ban last week to help ease those shortages.
And it's, it's something that lower down the piece, someone says that we're likely to see more of in future. I mean, it's quite interesting that it's going to be a recurring problem over the years in future. And, we've always assumed the whole country will have plenty of water, but maybe that's not going to be the case.
There have been similar stories in the French papers as well recently, so there are clearly, there's a concern there.
You wouldn't know it today.
Yeah, no, finally we got some rain. The one day we don't want it, Easter Monday. And let's have a look. What other stories on the front of the Telegraph? We've just got half a minute or so left. Syria, of course, there. Male mothers and the damned lies in NHS statistics. We'll have to have a look at that. Renounced European Court. Britain urged Britain should turn its back on the European Court of Human Rights because its rulings on the extradition of terror suspects. This is a story we've been covering today. Risk undermining the special relationship, a former US ambassador said yesterday. I think we're going to hear a lot more about that, aren't we? Extradition, I think, in the next few days. Thank you very much, Archie Bland and Nabila Ramdani, for taking us through tomorrow's papers as they came in.